Ernest has a knack for making complex global issues accessible, and his book, The War Below, Lithium, Copper, and the Global Battle to Power Our Lives, is already getting rave reviews, being hailed as an essential read for anyone seeking to understand the forces shaping our world today. Ernest's journey to become one of the foremost voices in energy journalism began in his home state of Maine, and his career has taken him from the shale oil fields of the United States to the halls of power, where he has reported on politics, the environment, and more. Along the way, he has held roles at the Associated Press and the Bangor Daily News, honing his craft and deepening his understanding of the critical issues he covers. Moderating today's discussions is someone equally passionate about the future of our planet, Sumedha Rao, the Executive Director of the Mayor's Office of Sustainability here in Louisville. Sumedha is dedicated to catalyzing robust, inclusive, and collaborative solutions for a greener Louisville. Her leadership and commitment to sustainability make her the perfect guide for today's conversation. We also want to thank the Office of Sustainability for their support. It's been invaluable, as well as the Filson Historical Society for being such gracious partners and hosts. We are so happy to have you all here with us. I know you could be anywhere else, but you're here, so thank you. Let's give a big welcome to Ernest Scheyder and our moderator, Sumedha Rao.
So, Ernest, thank you so much for being here. We're very happy to have you here in beautiful old Louisville, and you lucked out with the weather, came here right when we had the best to offer, so I hope you had a chance to enjoy that.
It's great to be here. Thank you for moderating. I love the Houston, so this is great.
That's great, yeah. So, before, I know everyone is dying to dive deeper into this book. So, before we do that, can you talk to us a little bit about your life and what led you to reporting on energy, and what question were you seeking to answer when you started on this journey to write this book?
Sure. So my journey with the energy space really started about 15 years ago when I joined Reuters in Times Square in New York. At the time, I was writing generally about energy topics, and we started to hear rumblings of this thing called fracking, not the pejorative, but an actual process that people were using to produce crude oil in new and novel ways. And I spent a lot of time writing about how it was revolutionizing the economies of Ohio, and Pennsylvania, and other regions, and looking at the different companies investing in technology and how it really was changing how the United States thought about the production of petroleum products. And then in 2013, 2014, I think I lost a bet or something at work because Reuters came to me and said, "You get to move to North Dakota." And so it came out of left field, and I said, "Come again?" They wanted me to move to western North Dakota, which was the epicenter at the time of the Bakken shale boom in that state. And at the time, North Dakota's economy was growing really the fastest in the world. Moving from New York City to North Dakota, I discovered the laws of supply and demand really quickly. My rent in North Dakota was more than double what I was paying in New York City. And that's just because there wasn't enough supply there. The demand was through the roof, and people were making gazillion dollars a year from the oil fields. And so I had a great opportunity to spend several years there writing about how this technological innovation was changing not only the economy of this particular state, but really the country, and really how we produce oil. And so as we sit here today in 2024, the U.S. produces more oil than any country at any time in history, largely due to fracking and due to other technological advancements along with it. But after about 2 years in North Dakota, I decided to change it up a little bit. So I moved to Houston to write about Exxon and Chevron and OPEC. And I can tell you, if you've never been to an OPEC meeting, they're quite the experience. A lot of jockeying, obviously, a lot of international geopolitics that go with that, and had a great opportunity to write about OPEC for several years. But I became curious the more I wrote about the oil and gas industry, about the energy transition. Of course, we had Elon Musk and Tesla on the scene at the time, and people were talking about going electric. And then, of course, also we saw the iPhone, the iPod come out, and really revolutionized how we think about communications and entertainment. But all those were powered by lithium-ion batteries, and so I became very curious about, okay, where is the critical minerals going to come from to power these areas, these devices? So the opportunity came up to switch my coverage from oil and gas to look at critical minerals, which at the time was sort of a very, very nascent space. The lithium industry historically has been focused on pharmacologics, has been focused on greases or glass, so very niche specific areas. It has not really, had at the time not really been a massive demand. So this is about 2018, I dove in head first to the area. And immediately I noticed a contrast with the oil and gas space. Whereas the average consumer, and this is an oversimplification, but I think it holds some truth for our conversation today. The average consumer might say that they put her or himself into maybe one or two camps. Either I think the oil and gas industry is deleterious for our planet and harmful, or I support it because of what it's doing for our economy and our standard of living. And again, I realize it's an oversimplification, but I think in general, people might tend to fall into one or two camps. But when it came to critical minerals, in general, people were like, oh sure, like lithium's great, cool. Copper, yeah, that's awesome, you know. Nickel, yeah, it has something to do with like the ring that I wear, I think, it might be a watch, I don't know, but cool, that's awesome. But when it came to specific projects, when it came to saying, we're gonna dig a mine here, we're gonna put this processing plant here, people for very specific regions to that site would say, no, I don't want this here, or you know, this is where I camped as a kid, so you can't put a mine here, or this has religious and cultural importance to my people, you can't do this here. And I became very curious about the needs for the energy transition, because when you add up each site, I said, okay, well, where are we going to get the building blocks for this energy transition? And we know that there are other places in the world that are rapidly increasing their production and are not recognizing and respecting ESG or environmental and social and government standards. And they're willing to sell these metals to the United States and primarily a bid for market share and global dominance. So what does that mean really for us in the United States? And so that's where the war below was born out. It was born out of that question about, okay, if we do broadly support the aims of the energy transition, we're not willing to have the conversations about where, how, and why we get the building blocks of the energy transition, what is it going to happen? And what could it look like if it did happen and we thought about a new framework for extractive industries? And are there some places too special to mine? And if that's true, what, and other places, how would we allow mining there? These are all the questions that I want to explore in the narrative. And I really had the great fortune to get the insight from a lot of different folks across the country and really the world for this book. I did focus it primarily on the United States because I wanted US audiences especially to have to grapple with these tough choices. I think especially the pandemic showed a lot of people that the topic of supply chains, which sounds boring, I mean, it is kind of a boring topic, but the pandemic really showed us that it's not necessarily a boring supply chain. You know, Sumedha, it was what, 4.5 years ago that we started to grapple with the pandemic, and we discovered at the time that we needed to wear masks, as the medical experts told us, but the United States didn't make any masks, and people were shocked. And that comes back to a supply chain issue, because years ago, somebody decided it would be cheaper to export the production of masks to someplace overseas and just ship them across the Pacific Ocean back to the United States. Now we just extrapolate that supply chain security to the green energy transition, and then you begin to realize that weather or a natural disaster or an armed conflict could block the importation of lithium or copper or nickel or cobalt or other critical minerals that are all sitting in your pockets right now in your iPhones or on your Apple Watches or other electronic devices that you're using. And so these are the things that matter, that really people should be debating. And so the book is an exploration of that choice. And the main question I'm asking is, what are the choices you're willing to make as a consumer when it comes to this energy transition, which is about so much more than electric vehicles. You know, I'm sure everyone in this room does not own an electric vehicle. You might own a vehicle powered by an internal combustion engine, you might not even own a vehicle. But these issues still matter to you because of all the electronic gadgets and gizmos that you're using today that are powered by lithium-ion batteries and other devices that might not have been even 15, 20, 30 years ago. So these matter to all of us. So that's the central thrust of the book and the main message that I wanted to bring to audiences.
Yeah, thank you for that, for kind of outlining that. It's such a complicated issue, and just to kind of give everybody context of what we're doing and the work that we're doing in Louisville. You know, we're seeing increasing incidences of extreme weather. We had historic flooding and storms and tornadoes in Kentucky. A lot of you who work with us closely know that Louisville is one was found to be one of the fastest warming urban heat islands by a Georgia Institute of Technology study a few years ago. So we're seeing the impacts of climate change, and as a result of that, communities and policy makers have asked us to act on it. So the work of our office has been to figure out how do we set goals around this and how do we engage community and make progress. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is this international body that consists of scientists and technical experts from around the world that have overwhelming consensus about what needs to happen, have basically said that the globe needs to get to net zero emissions by mid-century or sooner. And in alignment with those goals, our city has set goals of getting to net zero by 2040, which is ambitious, but needs to be so. And a lot of our emissions come from the building sector and the transportation sector, so that tends to be the work that we focus on. And historically, cities have mostly only tracked scope 1 and 2 emissions, which is basically what are you burning or emitting within the limits of your city or through the energy supply that you utilize. When we did the net zero emissions goals, we actually included scope 3 too, which includes supply chains. And people may say, why did you do that? You're never going to be able to figure that out. But I think the intent is set good goals and do your best, and that's kind of where we are. And we are starting to think about the extended implications of this because we live in such a connected world. And like you said, it's not really an easy question. I think we all at this point support a clean energy transition, or at least most people that I work with support a clean energy transition. But there are questions about what does this mean for biodiversity, what does this mean for indigenous communities, what does this mean for national security, and all of these other questions. And you do such a great job of laying out all of the different perspectives objectively. And so I guess my question was, you've really shown these diverse perspectives from clean energy transition needs to happen at any cost to not even a single endangered flower can be sacrificed for the clean energy transition, and the host of opinions in between. Do you see these opinions as kind of like a part of a healthy discourse that needs to happen in this energy transition, or do you feel like it's kind of distracting from making progress and getting to a more ideal energy transition?
So, thank you for the question. I see us, and I define us, and this is not only citizens and residents of the United States, but really of the world here. I see us on a site-specific or a project-specific instance having these dialogues. And what do I mean by that? I mean, if I'm a mining company and I want to dig a hole in the ground, I'm part of the conversation. Or if I'm a conservation group and I oppose you, I'm part of the conversation. Or if I need to buy lithium from a company, I'm part of the conversation. Or if I'm a regulator, I'm part of the conversation. But if I'm just doing my 9 to 5 and coming home, I'm not part of the conversation. And I argue as the author of the word below that person should be, because this issue affects all of those people I just mentioned and so many, many more. So I think for me the book was about expanding the dialogue or expanding the remit of that conversation to include so many more people. So when they come to policymakers such as yourself, or the mayor, or the governor, or the senators, or the president, or someone at the UN, they're able to speak with informed authority about these issues. You alluded to a flower, and if you'll forgive me for a few minutes, I'll just share a little bit about it, because it actually has a Kentucky connection. The narrative spine of the book is about the teens buckwheat flower, and this flower is found nowhere else on the planet except for a sliver of land about 200 miles north of Las Vegas in Nevada. And you immediately meet at the beginning of the narrative the chairman of a lithium company who used to be in oil and gas and has decided that lithium is sort of almost his penance, really, for his oil polluting past. And so he wants to develop a lithium project in Nevada to help leave the planet cleaner than the one that he found. Unfortunately, though, this deposit of lithium and this rare flower are one and the same. The flower loves this lithium deposit for reasons that still baffles botanists. And so right from the very beginning, you get this tension point, okay, what matters more, the lithium or the flower? And it has some really deep existential questions, because you meet a conservationist who says, of course the flower matters more because biodiversity matters. Like, why save a planet if there's nothing on it? We're just going to let everything go extinct in pursuit of stopping, turning the oven down lower. And it presents some issues that are not really black and white. Like, there's no clear-cut answer here. I mean, the conservationist says, if you let the this flower go extinct, well then what's next? Is it an animal? Is it a group of animals? Is it a group of even more important trees like sequoias, et cetera, et cetera? And there's no easy answers. The lithium company would say, well, if we did nothing to address climate change, wouldn't the flower go extinct? So we should extract the lithium. Well, and then there's also perhaps third way, like could the mine, which is an open pit mine, and the flower coexist? So these are the sticky answers that we're going through there. And while you read through the narrative, you discover that Ford, which is building the blue oil plant not far from here, signs a very large contract with the company to actually buy lithium. So if Ford and this lithium company are successful, lithium from that project will end up here in this area in a few years. But there lies sort of the tension, one of the tension points that I'm exploring in the book. And each chapter looks at proposed projects, most of which, as I mentioned, were in the United States. And each chapter is specifically about a project, but it's about basically a theme that connects to that project. Because at some point, the fate of the flower will be determined. One chapter looks at the tension over indigenous rights in Arizona, where a large mining company would want to develop a copper project that is strongly opposed by a Native American group for religious and cultural reasons. And there again, there's really tough issues to wade through. What matters more, the Native American religious rights or this copper that we desperately need for the energy transition? Would we dig up St. Peter's Basilica if it had a bunch of lithium underneath it? And if we said, gosh, we wouldn't do that, then why would we do it here for this Native American religious site? So all of the companies and those opposing them are definitely involved in these conversations, but I really want the work below to help expand the remit so that folks really dig through these tough areas, which don't have any easy answers, but we really need to be debating them more and more because these issues are becoming increasingly important.
Yeah, and I think you do a really good job of like expanding, because I definitely went into the book with some preconceived notions of what the opinions were going to be, and I found myself kind of conflicted and surprised by all the different viewpoints that were there. So I highly recommend it. Yeah. So on the topic of equity and kind of expanding the conversation to include more voices, that is something that we think about every day too with our energy transition. And I think, we look at it in two ways. Obviously on the one hand, you want to bring down the prices of clean energy transition as much as possible so that it's accessible and affordable to everybody, especially those that have been historically left out of the transition. But at the same time, at what cost are you bringing down those costs, and are you just externalizing them to other communities that you're not thinking about? So it is really complex, and I think sometimes if through a lot of the community engagement that we've done, and this comes up with energy, but it also comes up more with transportation, I would say. People talk about, I think people really question whether we're not paying enough attention to efficiency and conservation. I think we all know that there's a supply side problem that we need to solve, but in the work that you did and the people that you spoke to, how much did reducing consumption kind of play into the conversation? For example, I think you mentioned in your book that vehicle miles traveled, for example, have been growing over the years. In Louisville, we have over 95% of our commutes are single occupancy cars, compared to 40% is kind of the best practice that has been recommended to us by some folks that we talk to. So how much has that really played into the conversation? I know there's been a few voices that maybe advocate for that. So can you talk more?
I think, definitely a way to reframe how we think about consumption has to be part of the equation here. I think certainly, how we think about designing a lot of not only transportation but other devices has to be a huge part of it. For better or worse, I think when we look globally, different cultures have different approaches. Like the Dutch, for instance, love their bikes, and I think different cities in America are having different successes. Where I live in Houston, not as much success with bike lanes, but that's the hill I would die on. So I think generally, we need to be having a broader conversation about can we think about how we change our consumption habits. And for me, actually, part of that is recycling, which is why I have a pretty meaty chapter in the book about recycling. While I was writing the work below, the number one question I got from a lot of people is, why are you writing that book? Like, we just recycle our way there. And the data from the IEA and other intergovernmental organizations organizations tell us that A, no, we can't just recycle our way completely to an energy transition, but that B, one day we might be able to. Like, we're gonna hit a point at some point where we're at a fully circular economy, whereas every single old cell phone, electric vehicle, etc., you can turn it in and basically take the critical minerals out and make new lithium-ion batteries and make new equipment. Now, anyone that tells you they know when we're actually gonna get to that point, you know, is speaking with certainty. Some people say 2050, some people say 2060, but we do know at some point the last mine will be dug, and unlike an internal combustion engine where the crude oil is burned off, lithium doesn't lose its ability to retain a charge just because it's been sitting in a battery for 20 or 30 years. So that's actually a really, really good thing. You know, we're not just sort of making some of the same mistakes like keeping on digging here that we did with the petroleum-based economy. But I think recycling and also thinking about how we change our approach to consumption and consumerism has to be part of the equation. You know, I'm sure most people in here at one point found out on an internal combustion engine. When your battery dies, it's a lead acid battery, you might not even realize it, but there's a whole system in the background that you're paying for that helps you recycle the lead acid battery. I'm sure you are fully aware. But there's a small percentage fee, call it a few bucks, and it pays for this whole system that's in the background that recycles that lead acid, puts it into a new battery, and then if you buy a new lead acid battery, bada bing, it's there. And that structure is not necessarily there yet for lithium-ion batteries due to many factors. But I think at some point we're going to have to get to that where people are maybe paying a small percentage more for every device that has a lithium-ion battery to fund some kind of back channel. Because right now, some of the recyclers I talk about in the book, I chronicle too, especially their startups, so you get to learn a little bit about their journey. The economics of recycling are factored by many things, but two main things is logistics, which surprised me when I started writing the book, because it's not the actual recycling itself, it's getting this stuff to a recycling center, because there's just not enough of them across the country. And then also, depending on where prices for lithium and cobalt and nickel, etc. are, either they'll take that old battery for free and recycle it because they know they can sell it, or if they're too low, they're going to say, no, you have to pay me to recycle this. And so then you're just like, gosh, that changes the whole economics of this, and that can make the whole process just untenable. So having some sort of more financial surety around there, I think would make the recycling part of it that much more economically feasible. But yes, it's got to be a reframing in how we think about how we use products. And I would do argue in the book that the era of us just sort of showing up to a store and expecting things to be there is fading away, and the pandemic, I think, accelerated that.
Yeah, and let's talk about supply some more, because I think that I go to a lot of DOE conferences for better or worse, and this question comes up a lot. Yeah, and so when you're talking, when industry leaders and policymakers that you've talked to, when they've talked about supply, is typically the solution we're just going to find more mines, or we are going to scale recycling, or maybe there's a new material out there that isn't so lithium dependent, or is that kind of science fiction at this point, or is it just we really don't know?
Yes to all of those, depending on who you talk to. People have said all of those things to me in many more areas for years. I think, if you talk to policymakers on the federal level, there's definitely a desire to get us to this energy transition faster, but there's not a healthy acknowledgement of the supply side of where we're going to actually get these critical minerals. And I highlight several examples in the book where the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, and pieces of legislation set out some really positive and well-meaning aims without seemingly fully thinking through, okay, well, where are we going to actually get this stuff to build these batteries, or to build these wind turbines, or to build these solar panels? And to me, they're linked. They're just implicitly linked. The IRA includes a tax credit for electric vehicles if that electric vehicle is made with critical minerals extracted from the United States or countries that have a U.S. free trade deal. But if you can't get the critical minerals, you can't get the tax credit, so then sort of stops the whole EV industry and extracts the manufacturing industry. So it's very much a chicken and egg thing, and just found several examples time and time again where projects were either halted or stopped by federal regulators due to various reasons that I'm not casting aspersions on, but it's merely pointing out that it doesn't line up with the intended goal of trying to get us to to a fully circular economy or sort of achieving the aims of the legislation on a more basic level. And so time and time again, that came up. One area that I think, so I guess you might say, okay, cool, that seems like a cooler, great. That's a giant thing to actually try to unpack. One area that I do hope we can, maybe as Americans, try to unpack is our mining laws. And on the federal level, Sumedha, the law that's governing U.S. mining has been around since 1872. Ulysses S. Grant signed it. Now, I wasn't alive then, I wasn't around, but I'm pretty sure they did not have cell phones. I'm pretty sure they did not have electric vehicles. I'm pretty sure they didn't even have electricity. And so the law was written in order to populate the U.S. West. And for anyone that's been to California lately, it's populated. There's a lot of people there. And so the law has had its intended effect. But the law also has a few other side perks in it for the mining industry that are interesting. So if you own a mine, or you control a mine on federal land and you take out copper, you don't pay royalties to the U.S. federal government, aka taxpayers, being you and everyone in this room. Now, oil and gas companies would kill for that perk, because oil and gas companies pay at least 8% when they take oil out of federal lands or waters. There's some other things in there as well that were clearly designed in the 19th century to encourage economic development of a region that is developed. And so the permitting process is also very confusing. You know, if you own, say, 1,000 acres or control 1,000 acres in Nevada and you wanted to start a mine, where do you start? Like, who do you call? Like, even the process of getting to a no is extremely confusing right now. And so if our ultimate goal, if our top of the pyramid goal is to say, okay, climate change is one of the biggest existential threats of our time, we've got to focus on getting to net zero, we've got to push in that direction, then we have to acknowledge that sort of what's at the bottom of the pyramid in this metaphor matters, like how we actually build the products that help us maintain our standard of living and get us to that goal. I could go on all day.
Yeah, but I mean, speaking of mining regulations, something that that's kind of stuck out to me in the book is you talk about this company Perpetua that is modeling some interesting and possibly good examples of how a mining company can approach working with the community. And something that they said is, if we're going to need to mine anyway, then why not put a mine where in a region that's maybe has already been mined previously, kind of like, we're hearing a lot of that from the Department of Energy now in terms of doing clean energy development on brownfields and Superfund sites and areas that already don't have other kind of ecological value that you would be taking away. So on that note, can you talk about what is maybe a best example that you've seen of a company that may be doing this right, that the industry can learn from, and that maybe gives you hope for where the industry can go?
So, what Peter was referring to sort of as a concept known as brownfield versus greenfield. Brownfield, sort of as the name implies, has been dug already. It might either be a mine that was sort of put on care and maintenance, or just sort of sitting there. And a greenfield is a brand new mine. And so there is plenty of old mine sites across the United States and really in the world. And the question is, can we reopen them? And is there still stuff in the ground, basically? And one chapter of the book that actually was not in my initial plan for the book, it sort of came to me during the writing, was this project in Idaho known as the Stibnite Project. And this is a project that doesn't make sort of a key critical mineral for batteries, but still a critical mineral known as antimony. And this is used to make bullets, and this is used to make hardening agents for aircraft carriers. So you can kind of guess who wants this mine to open just based on those end uses. It's also used in fire retardants and other consumer applications. And so the site had been active during World War II. It had closed. It became a Superfund site, still controlled by the U.S. federal government, but the U.S. government just sort of had it sit there. The Environmental Protection Agency was created in the 70s. Again, still this whole site sat there. And in addition to all that antimony sitting there, there's a lot of gold. And so this becomes a really interesting proposition for this company known as Perpetual Resources. It wants to get to the gold. It also knows antimony is extremely important for uses in these consumer devices as well as to the Pentagon. Their big sales to the federal government is, hey, give us the permits to activate this mine again, and we'll be off to the races. You'll have all this antimony, which, by the way, China is the biggest producer in the world of, and we get access to the gold. And so it brings up an interesting question around what's known as a Good Samaritan Agreement. and this legislation has floated around Congress for years, but the company doesn't want to open this mine and then be sued by everyone for the Superfund status and say, we'll actually pay to clean up the site, but we don't necessarily want to bear the legal liability. And so we'll see where that goes in Congress. The company's currently in permitting right now. It's trying to get its permits hopefully very soon. I hear there's a potential change in administration coming up. So we'll see what happens in the next few months. But it does, to your point, bring up really interesting questions. Like if I think it's more of an existential question. Okay, where would we allow mining? Like we can talk about, okay, there are some places, no, we don't necessarily want mining, but surely with this place where there already is a quote-unquote hole in the ground, there is a little hole in the ground, would we not want it to be there as well? And these are some of the more things that I'm bringing to the reader to sort of think through and to say, okay, well, surely this place could be an area where we wouldn't think about it. But it has its opposition. I mean, it's in the middle of nowhere, Idaho, that has very pristine value from an environmental and ecological perspective. So it's part of the dynamic to think through.
Yeah, and I think the other layer to that is you could say, there's already these pieces of land that have been extracted before that we can continue to extract from, or the communities might say, so you're going to just keep extracting from my community until the end of time, and that's a valid question. So speaking of IRA, I know we talked about that, and of course the impending election, it's been convention week. Yes. So I think that we can all safely say that this is going to go one of two ways. So, and we have like we talked about earlier, we have the benefit of having a little hint of how each one is going to go because we've had some experience. So what would you say you would foresee, knowing that you're not a fortune teller, but with either option?
Yeah, I think, first off, I will say, I do hope the Vice President talks about climate tonight, like this, in her acceptance speech. Unfortunately, I think maybe I'll speak for both of us here, I'm going to speak out of line. We've unfortunately not seen climate be as big an issue this campaign cycle as perhaps 2020 or 2016. I hope that changes, because I think these are extremely important topics that we all affect us all. I think we do have the benefit of looking at the past 3.5, 4 years in a Biden-Harris administration and using that potentially as a guidepost to where the Harris administration would go. Vice President Harris cast the tiebreaking vote for the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S. Senate. Obviously, that was a key vote to push the legislation over the finish line, has been part of the implementation in her role as Vice President, has made very many statements when she was in the U.S. Senate, as well as her role as Attorney General in the state of California. So I think we have a sense of where she would go. President Trump, obviously, we had his 4 years when he was in office, from 2017 to 2021. The IRA was not the law then, but he did have a more, shall we say, accepting approach to most mining projects, not all, but most. He did approve several of the projects I talk about in the book, Resolution Copper, which is being opposed by the San Carlos Apache in Arizona. He approved the Thacker Pass Lithium project, which is opposed by some ranchers and native groups in Nevada, and a few others. Interestingly, he killed the Pebble Mine project in Alaska, partly because Tucker Carlson and his son love fishing in that watershed. But more broadly, I think it's we do have his 4 years in office and the Vice President's sort of 3.5, 4-ish years in office as a guidepost. In the context of the IRA, which President Trump opposed, I think it's helpful to think through what it actually was. In many ways, it was more of a national security piece of legislation than an actual climate piece of legislation. At least that's how Senator Manchin wrote it. And let's remember when it was passed. It passed it a few months after Russia had invaded Ukraine, and Senator Manchin and his team could see that the geopolitics were aligning in a sort of way where if our global economy is going to go in an electrification way, well then who's going to control the building blocks? And so I think that's why you see some of the mechanisms built into the IRA that are linked to countries that are U.S. allies or countries that have U.S. free trade deals. And he'll be the first to admit it's an imperfect way to think about an ally, because for instance, the only country in the African continent with a free trade deal is Morocco, not the DRC, not Zambia, both of which are packed full of critical minerals. But that's for the next Congress to decide, I guess. But long-winded way of answering your question would be, I think we have the benefit of their track record, and we can use that to say, okay, where could things go moving forward? But I do certainly hope that climate becomes a bigger part of this campaign.
So, a kind of a fun question, I guess, but what surprised you the most as you were on this journey writing this book? Did you pretty much foresee what you found out? Was there something that surprised you?
Well, so two things I would say about that. First off, at its core, this is a book about community and choice, and about the people at the center of those communities and making those choices. And so I met a lot of really interesting people that graciously gave their time and insight. I camped out for several nights with a guy in the middle of nowhere and talked about his opposition to a lithium mine, the gentleman who supports the Team's buckwheat. Spent a lot of time with him. The gentleman who wants to develop a mine at that Team's buckwheat site. Spent a lot of time with him, and got to see a lot of human interaction behind the scenes. And so, people are fascinating to me, and at its core, this is a book about people. On a more technical level, when I switched from covering oil and gas to covering critical minerals, I just noticed the sheer complexity of the space. So I think people in general understand how crude oil is processed into a consumer form. So generally it comes out of the ground, it goes into a pipe, it goes into a refinery, and you might get kerosene or gasoline or jet fuel, etc. People roughly have an understanding of that. But with critical minerals, there's like a gazillion of them, and they each can have different ways of, they certainly do have different ways of how they're extracted out of the ground, and how they're processed, and how they're put into forms that are usable in like our cell phones or our watches, etc., or the lights in the ceiling. Just lithium alone has 2 or 3 different types of what's known as source rock, which basically means the geological deposit in the ground, which is found. Several ways of how it's actually then processed into 2 main types. There's lithium hydroxide or lithium carbonate, and depending on what your kind of battery you're making, you might want one over the other. Or if you're putting it into like the uses I mentioned earlier, like a pill or grease or glass, you might have it to entirely different. So it's a really, really, really broad spectrum of uses, and it adds to the complexity of these supply chains that we were talking about earlier. But for me, it brings up yet another question. There's a lot of questions here, but if we are really focused on addressing the climate, and if we think that the geopolitics of this, since we are at the World Affairs Council, the geopolitics of this matters, would it not behoove us to have more of the production and processing of these critical minerals regionally, in the United States or North America or in this part of the world, so that we're reducing the carbon emissions from transportation, so that we have security of supply as we go on this climate journey, and as we can ensure energy security, or at least strive for it as best as we can.
Absolutely. And on that note, final question is, you've covered the shale revolution, you've covered critical minerals, so what's next? Are there any lingering questions that you want to get into for the next big project?
I will say one book at a time, but I did just get a pitch about asteroid mining earlier today, so the war above, maybe that's coming next. So, but it's not a joke actually, people are trying to mine asteroids. So stay tuned.
All right, well, thank you so much for your time, and thank you everyone for being here. I hope that I try to steer clear of jargon and acronyms, but unfortunately I do tend to use a lot of that, so I apologize if there was some of that, but this book is really insightful and very accessible, and I really appreciate that. So I think we can open it up for some audience questions now.
Yes, yeah, I'll take your questions.
I got it. 1 second.
Question? Okay.
Does the United States have the ability to acquire minerals and petroleum or other resources that we're going to need 50 and 100 years from now? I don't want to put an investment into something that's going to not pay off for 50 or 100 years from now, but I'm sure my grandchildren and whoever's president at the time would like to have access to resources that our private sector isn't thinking about right now. I don't know whether to think about it. I guess that's part of the question.
Thank you for the question. I would say that this is the eternal question in Washington. Like, should the federal government be stockpiling? Should the federal government be encouraging research in certain areas? Should the federal government be encouraging private companies to invest in certain areas? The future, as you mentioned, of course, is unknown, it's uncertain, so it's hard to say how much lithium the United States is going to need in 50 years. You know, a question I get a lot when I talk about the war below is sodium-ion batteries, which is a relatively new nascent space. Sodium is heavier than lithium, so you might not necessarily put it in a car, I mean, I guess you could. But there increasingly are people putting capital into sodium-ion batteries. Now, what I will say is I don't know the future, of course, of the sodium-ion battery adoption rates are going to be. But what I do say is to share a bit of an anecdote. You know, if you remember back to, say, 1989, 1990, this company known as Sony, you might have heard of, started to sell these things called Walkmans with rechargeable batteries. They were lithium-ion batteries. And that was around 1989, 1990. George H.W. Bush was president. And here we are today in 2024. And just think about that timeline to make lithium-ion batteries ubiquitous. It's 30, 35, 40 years, right? I mean, so it took a while for that mass adoption. And that required a lot of manufacturers to get comfortable with the technology, a lot of mining companies to be able to supply the critical minerals, not just the lithium. They required technologists and other designers to design products, like, you know, the watch I'm wearing around lithium-ion batteries, make them smaller, make them more agile, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a whole host of, science that's gone into that. So to just change the chemistry of a battery in the future would require a lot of science as well. So it's an unknown, I guess, at this point, but there are a lot of investments. Now, I do have a chapter in the book that talks about a U.S. company that owned this large cobalt mine in the DRC, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. But because of a failed investment in the oil space, it was basically up to the ceiling in debt and had to sell that. Washington didn't stop it, and today the Chinese government-linked companies control it. So unfortunately, you probably have heard of children as young as 6 or 7 that mine cobalt out of the ground. Sadly, that's partly because linked to this sale, which the company regretted but had to, or otherwise, it would have been in worse financial straits. So I would encourage you to look at that chapter and sort of look at it. You do see companies, of course, in the US looking overseas. What we do see, though, is Chinese companies getting even more aggressive right now, thinking about that long term. Okay, where are we going to go in 30, 40, 50 years? And what will our needs be? And they're investing as such.
Has anyone done any cost-benefit analysis based on the economics of different parts of society? For example, if you were in San Francisco versus someone living in Kentucky in the rural part, there's totally different cost and benefit analysis. Has anyone done any work on cost-benefit analysis with different aspects of society?
Do you mean with regard to the energy transition, or?
The different paths forward, the different options. Because without a cost-benefit analysis, there is no progress.
I think certainly, and maybe you might, in your role, have a greater insight on this, but I think certainly, living in a rural, I grew up in Maine, in rural Maine, so living in rural Maine is different than living in downtown San Francisco, certainly, and there are, different ways to approach kind of mitigation, and you don't need a car in San Francisco, you do if you're in a rural state, so there's a lot of different moving parts there, and I think probably people a lot smarter than me crunch the numbers on that.
I mean, because your messaging would have to be different to one target audience versus another. And I don't see any different messaging at all. It's one great big message. It doesn't apply to everybody.
Yeah, and I think to your point, it is still a very federal level conversation. I don't think there's a lot of local conversations that are happening when it comes to, there are, of course, the mining companies, depending on where the extraction is happening, the processing, there are cost-benefit analysis that go into those specific facilities. But I think from a consumer standpoint, I don't know that we've gotten very far in that area.
Fascinating subject, really, really. It's not boring in the slightest. I work in the clean energy space, and there's a question that's forever in my mind, and I'm not expecting a magic answer to this, but I'd be interested in your opinion. Early in my career, I was the person who validated supply chains in some fairly dodgy parts of the world and made sure there was no child labor, that people weren't being kind of killed or injured in a significant way. And I then spent a lot of time researching consumer intent and reasons for purchase in a whole range of countries around the world. What I saw is many other first world countries have a much greater awareness in their consumer class as to the ethics of purchasing, and they ask those questions of their supermarkets, of their retailers, and there is significant pressure which 20, 25 years ago in some parts of the world moved people in a more ethical direction. So they were already on those filters there, they used their muscle to cause change. In the US, frankly, I don't see those filters. The filter tends to be, is it cheap and can I get it tomorrow on Amazon? You know, if we're to make the changes you talk about, we've got to have an informed and demanding consumer group. And I don't see that right now. Do you see any way we might awaken that power and use it to get some of the results we're looking for?
Yeah, I think you've hit a huge nerve there. A few weeks ago at Reuters, we did a big story on green premiums for critical minerals, which is a very wonky topic, but at its core, it's like if you want to make sure that, in this example we were sharing earlier, that there are not children that are part of the cobalt supply chain, well, you need to be paying X% more for sustainably sourced cobalt. It has echoes of, say, the fair trade coffee movement, and I'll grant you, like, you know, a cup of coffee, the price point is very different than, say, an electric vehicle. And therein sort of lies the rub. You know, if you're going to increase the cost of an electric vehicle by whatever the percentage point is, you know, that automaker, which already has extremely thin margins, 1-2% is the margin for an electric vehicle right now, you know, their cost profile is going to change dramatically. So General Motors, for instance, really wants to do the right thing, but they're not willing to pay more for ethically sourced critical minerals. They just want the whole industry to be ethical. And that's sadly not a realistic expectation right now. And we know this from our reporting across the world from examples that you just shared. But you're right, I mean, there are areas, pockets, where consumers are affecting change. Coffee is one, apparel is another. Remember a few years ago there was a large fire at a factory in Bangladesh that made clothing for very, very expensive premium brands. And many Americans in the West were shocked to learn that the very expensive clothing that they bought was made in a sweatshop in this country where people were working in conditions where they did not have fire sprinklers, where there was not safety, they were not paid a living wage, they were not allowed, you know, they were working in atrocious conditions, and that many of them died. And so that has slowly started to cause change in the apparel industry. But there again, even a sweater is at the same price point as like something that's much more like an electric vehicle. So yes, I mean, it's going to have to take consumers that are going to say that, and just to take the electric vehicle example, like if I'm buying an electric vehicle, I want to know that I'm actually helping the planet, because I sort of feel good when I'm not actually emitting emissions. That's great, but like, how did the cobalt come out of the ground? Like, did the lithium come out of the ground ethically and, you know, respecting the water? And these can be heady and sort of dense topics, but I do have a chapter in the book that talks about a mining certification scheme known as IRMA. And there are many certification schemes out there. For me, IRMA was really, really interesting because it's designed to use the power of private industry here in a way that hasn't been marshaled before. So because many host governments have sort of been reticent to talk about changing their mining laws, including in the United States, IRMA, which was founded in part by Tiffany and Company, as well as conservation groups, was an attempt to say, okay, how can we improve the standards of mines? How can we do this by using the free market, by giving companies an incentive to ethically produce critical minerals? And you know, the full backstory is in that chapter, but as we all sit here today, you can pull out your phone and look at the IRMA audit report for the Albemarle lithium operations in northern Chile. And why do I mention that? Albemarle is the world's largest lithium company, and Chile has the world's largest lithium reserves. So you can go on your phone right now and figure out exactly how the workers are paid there, how much water they take out of the ground, do they pay the people a living wage? If there's an accident, do they have safety plans in place for neighbors? how do they store chemicals, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole host of factors by which this operation was judged. And that matters for a company known as Tesla and Volkswagen, which some of you may have heard of because they buy lithium from this site. And they want to know that the lithium that they buy and put into their vehicles is ethically sourced and meets these standards. So you've got companies like BMW, Microsoft, Ford, Volkswagen, Tesla, and others that have signed on to IRMA standards. So I think increasingly we're going to get to that point, but that still leaves a whole host of critical minerals production out there that's not associated with IRMA, that is flooding the market with cheap supplies of these critical minerals that are making it harder for Western miners to stand up their operations. So it creates this whole new vortex for Western miners to have to contend with, and a whole new challenging thing for us to consider as we move forward in the energy transition. And there's no easy answers, but I think the more we talk about it in settings like this and others, then we'll come to some greater understanding.
So I think that's a very good segue into my question. So the narrative around our election is really around immigration, but it's not in this particular context. You've alluded to some of the conflict issues, but also climate change. And I think we're seeing immigration really being, when caused by many of the conflicts that you've mentioned, but also in the United States, we know that climate change is ultimately going to lead to immigration within continental U.S. And so I'm just curious, in your book, if you mention anything around any early warning mechanisms are in place or policy directives to help us manage this as we look towards kind of fighting against what I would dare say, it's no longer a matter of if, but more when we'll have to deal with the impacts.
First of all, I definitely agree with you. I think it's a matter of if, but when. We can see the effects of climate change. I mentioned earlier that in Houston now, I think they had a heat index today of like 113, 114, in a place that is not designed for that. So it is coming. I talked earlier about sort of the one key message that I had, or question to the audience is what are the choices you're willing to make. Indecision is a choice. Putting our heads in the sand is an actual action. And so by us not wanting to actually grapple with these things, well then we just do kick the can down the road. And we know that has, anyone kicking the can down the road for anything in your life, eventually you keep walking and you will come up to that said can. And so it behooves us to have these conversations now. We didn't, and we as a world here in this sentence, we didn't really have these conversations 100 or 150 years ago when the petroleum-based economy took off. And what did we get out of that? We got multiple wars, fighting over crude oil. We got climate change. We got OPEC, a big cartel that controls a huge chunk of the world's petroleum production. And so if we don't really have these conversations now, we are in danger of making the same mistakes here in the 21st century going into the 22nd century. And that's not just my opinion. There's multiple analysts I cite in the book that prognosticate the vast number of problems. In fact, one talks about seeing wars over copper, which is sort of crazy when you think about it, seeing armed conflicts over this red metal. But think about it, copper is used everywhere, and in nearly every single device. You've got a bunch of it in your pockets right now, and you don't even realize it. And it's so important for this electrification trend. So it sounds kind of crazy, but you can sort of see that maybe that could be. You're already seeing companies fighting over copper with big M&A offers to buy each other because it's just so hard to dig a new mine out there. So this is sort of the paradigm shift that I'm really hoping the reader to think through about where we're going, because how we talk to our policymakers matters about these areas.
Okay, you know what, we're going to have one more question. Who is, did you? I'm sorry, closest.
Hello.
So, I understand that most of the mineral supply in the world is actually under the ocean.
Save the best question for last. I knew this one was coming.
Okay. So tell me about what's happening with all the parts of the ocean that are not under treaties or boundaries, and what's going to happen?
Well, if you know, find me after and I'll buy you a drink. This is a very complex area. It is a portion at the very end of my book because it is part of it. It does need to be part of the conversation. Not to get too technical, I'll give you the Reader's Digest version on this. There are three main sort of undersea deposits. They're typically what we think of digging an open pit mine, but just think about digging it under the water. There are things known as seamounts, which are sort of basically mini volcanoes that come up that can add a lot of metals mixed in with magma, and etc. And then these potato-sized nodules that are found in parts of the ocean, most prolifically in this region, sort of south of Hawaii and west of Mexico, known as the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. And these nodules are filled with a lot of manganese and nickel and copper. We just don't really know why they're there. They formed over a gazillion years. We just don't know what function they serve in the deep recesses of the ocean. And this is like a mile or two beneath the surface of the water. And because it's an international water, the United Nations has this thing called the Law of the Sea that aims to sort of govern how we, as a species, basically interact with the ecology of the oceans. And it's headquartered in Kingston, Jamaica, and they have been actively debating for years rules over how best to interact with these nodules. And so there are several companies, one in particular that's backed by Glencore, that would like to take those nodules, throw them into a smelter, and bada bing, you get minerals. It's great. You don't have to dig a hole in the ground, you don't have to fight over indigenous rights or biodiversity. But because we don't really know how these nodules interact with the ecology and the environment a mile or two under the surface of the water, there's a lot of concern that we could irreparably harm the world's oceans. We know more about outer space than we do about the oceans of our planet. And so therein lies the tension and the rub. It's another thing for us to think through. I mean, certainly if we need these critical minerals, it's a very tantalizing prospect there to go down and to grab them. But what are the potential long-term implications of it? I don't purposely come to any answers in the book. And I should say as we wrap up that you don't know when you finish reading the book what my opinion is on any of these critical minerals projects. And I do that.
I tried to get him to share an opinion.
Because I think it's so important for us really to debate amongst ourselves, to think for ourselves, would I be okay with these nodules coming out of the bottom of the ocean? Would I be okay with digging up an indigenous holy site? Would I be okay with this flower going extinct? What do I think about this? Certainly I have my opinions, I'm a human, everyone does, but I really want you as the reader to have to sit there in the murky middle and to say, okay, like, what would I do if I was in Kamala Harris or Donald Trump's seat, or if I, were sitting in the Bureau of Land Management office and deciding whether to approve a mine or not, or what would I expect of my elected officials, especially at this key inflection point, as the gentleman in the back was saying, it's not if, but it's when. And so these are really key areas for us to have to really grapple with, to dig into, to forgive the pun, and I really hope the book is part of this broader conversation. So thank you all for being here.
All right. All right, well, I just want to, hi everyone, wonderful to see you all. And my name is Sumedha, I'm the president of the World Affairs Council, and I want to thank you all for joining us tonight, and really for both Sumedha and Ernest for coming all the way from Houston, although I think this is a nice reprieve from the heat, so he's happy. It's not hardship, But I really wanted to say how much we appreciate this conversation, because many of you have been may have attended a lot of World Affairs Council's programs in the past, and you may have seen how in the last couple of years the conversation has been a little bit different, right? Because we've been focusing a lot on climate change, environmental energy types of topics, because this is one of these areas that I think it's not getting enough of a highlight in some ways, but it's really an area where nations and different countries really have to come together. It's truly the most global of global issues, right? And so that's why it's important for us to continue to cover this and have people like Ernest or people like Sumedha to really come and kind of give us some of the deeper knowledge. Now, I really want to say this book, I understand, is very good because it's mother approved. So if Ernest's mom has said this is a very good book and she can understand, now she can be a very smart lady, much more so than us, but I think that's a great recommendation. I really encourage you to get in. It's laid out in very easy chapters, and it's very much of a storytelling type of way. It's a narrative, so very easy to consume. But it's one of these topics I think we all really need to know now than later. So thank you for that wonderful conversation. And so I also thank for Sumedha's work. She's been here for a couple of years, but it's been really ramping up. I know she's really gotten her team together, and we're really looking forward to some great things from her office. Just a couple of quick things. This kind of conversation, we have opportunities for you all to discuss intimately, more in a one-on-one basis through our Great Decisions discussion series. We actually covered a lot of climate materials a couple of times in the past, and it was a really very inspiring and very kind of enriching conversation. We learned a lot from each other. So that is one of these discussion types of programs that the World Affairs Councils offer to our members and to people in the community, so that you get a chance to actually voice your views and what you've learned, and we share each other's insights into this, so we can all learn more and maybe do a little bit more. And then finally, just a couple of things. If you're not a member, I know many of you are, and maybe your membership will be coming due soon, which is fine, because we're rolling out some new membership levels. That's going to be coming in September, so keep your eyes open. And if you're not, I really encourage you to consider supporting the World Affairs Council by becoming a member, because membership really supports this kind of conversation. As you all know, we don't get to have this kind of conversation on a regular basis in local communities, because global issues sometimes are not really seen as local issues, but as we have seen today, it's very much local, right? So please consider joining us as a member and support the World Affairs Council. And very lastly, if you are joining us for dinner tonight, we are going to be having dinner at NAMI, not Bucks, NAMI. And if you need the address, you can talk with Bella or Will at the front desk. And I am really looking forward to all of you joining us for the dinner, if you've signed up. And if not, the next program is going to be in October 22nd. We're going to be featuring a speaker talking about cybersecurity, international cyber warfare, all of the not so fun stuff, but very important, just like climate change. I feel like every time I talk, we have conversations, it's always the gloom and doom kind of conversations, but it's important. So I hope you will stay tuned and make sure you're on our email list so you get all the information of all the opportunities we have to get you engaged with global issues. Thank you so much.
Exactly. You have to, that's what matters.